Welcome to Masters of Color, brought to you by lowpost.com and ravengrade.com. I'm your host, Cullen Kelly, and my guest today is Eric Weidt. As David Fincher's colorist of choice for the last several years, Eric has an impressive list of credits that includes Mank, Mindhunter, and House of Cards. His work on these projects extends far beyond the traditional tasks of color grading, incorporating complex look modeling and incredibly detailed adjustments on virtually every frame. The techniques and the insights that he shared with me during our conversation are truly next level. This episode is sponsored by pixelview.io, an affordable streaming solution for editors and colorists. It's an all-in-one solution that just works. Simply plug in the encoder and start streaming. Now with built-in video chat, it enables easy collaboration with remote clients, allowing you to review and discuss changes in real time while everyone is watching the same high-quality image. You can use promo code MASTER to get a 15% discount on a hardware encoder at pixelview.io. And now, let's get into my conversation with Eric Weidt. Eric, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm great. I just had a long weekend, so I'm all jazzed up and full of good energy.
I love it. Yeah, it's funny. Like I sometimes catch myself like getting grumpy about like having too much on my plate or whatever, but like about 2 days down, and then just like you said, like by the time I come back today, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so excited! I've got all this stuff I want to do.
Yeah. You wake up thinking about the things you're going to do today.
Yeah, which is the ideal. Obviously, we have cool jobs.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for joining me for this color chat, man. I have probably about 3 days worth of questions that I could drill you with, but I'm going to try to get as much into the next hour or so as possible.
Okay, I'll try to answer real fast.
Yeah, super fast. So here's the one I want to start with. This is actually, I was thinking about this over the weekend. So have you those memes where it's like, like what my parents think I do, what society thinks I do, what I really do. Have you seen those?
No, I haven't, but I've had that sort of conundrum. Yes. Explaining what I do.
Yes. I mean, I think it's like, they're popular for colorists in general because it's such a, like, nobody understands what the hell we do.
Right.
But I think it's especially interesting in your case, because if I think about like, if I rewind and I go to like young Cullen, like just getting started as a colorist and just starting to think about charting a career in color, and I talk to him about the job of like, hey, someone's job, there's some colorist out there who's one day going to have the job of being essentially like the personal colorist to one of the greatest directors in the history of cinema, one of the greatest working directors for sure. So there's like, for most of us who know of you and know that you somewhat play that role for David Fincher, I think a lot of us have like a lot of sort of like grand visions of like, wow, what must that be? Like our imaginations run away with us of like, what is Eric's life as David Fincher's colorist look like? But as those memes go, I feel like there's probably a version of that of like what other colorists think you do, like what people outside of our industry think you do, and then like what you actually do. So this is all like a very long-winded way of asking like, what is it actually like to be the go-to colorist for such a incredible and like exacting director?
I get to see his process and his work from conception to the very last frame, because sometimes I'm there in a sort of pre-production meeting, and I'm definitely there all the way to the end. It's, right now, for example, I'm seeing dailies come in from the current shoot, and whenever there's a question, is that overexposed? Or, I'll request the R3Ds. I'll do a little grade here and there to reassure both Eric and David that they're getting exactly what they need, and they can continue shooting. One thing I do that people maybe aren't aware of yet is that I'm also, when I'm not working on a current project, I'm also doing remasters for him. So I recently got the Social Network, which I simply had to regrade adapt for HDR. In that case, it was just taking an existing color master and repurposing it for HDR, and then submitting it to David for all kinds of notes that are simply David having evolved for the last 10 years and in what his current concerns and his color, ameliorations, how would you call it, his color improvements on what he did 10 years ago with Ian Verbeck at Light Iron, who, Ian, if you're watching, hello, great. It's always weird to take somebody else's work, but you don't see it that way. You just take the project at hand, and you perform the tasks that are asked of you, as best you can. And hopefully, and all you're looking for is a green light from David saying, I like that. And, not some comment that you have to wrangle, and whatnot.
Oh, that's cool. I mean, like the way you're describing that remastering process, and also when I'm like thinking about what your work must generally be when you're doing your grades, is like, I've seen enough like little snippets of you. Like there was a great video I think that you did with Baselight where you were like grading some shots for Mindhunter, like kind of shot by shot for a little bit. And I'm looking at that stuff and I'm going, man, like all colorists, all color grading is about fine detail, but man, are you getting granular, and not just because that's like your level of detail that you like to get into, but clearly that's like the level of precision that notes are coming in at, in terms of like knocking one little corner down or bringing one little piece up. So like back to that, I think like maybe what I was wondering about in terms of like what it's actually like to work with David Fincher, is it just all like chasing little details like that? How much of it is focused on the big picture? Like what is the feel of this job compared to working for someone else?
Well, it can feel like you're chasing details, and you're chasing a lot of concerns that he has that sometimes are quite brutal. He's really makes you focus on something that you think, man, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole of having to, look at, 3 scenes, one little shadow in the corner there. It needs to be consistent throughout those 3 scenes, or, the color of a door jamb or something like that. But that's the hard part of grading. And if you were to talk to yourself, or to any other colorist, prospective colorist, somebody who's looking to go into color saying, oh, I love color. Well, the appeal of color is the absolute fascination with cinematography, with photography, with light and color. And it's very sexy, for a certain type of person. But the reality is that étalonnage or grading in French, it means to balance and to make sure everything is consistent. That's, I would say it's 90% of what I do. Yes, I take things, and when I first get a hold of it, and I'm always working behind the scenes to anticipate what David wants. My general, I generally know that he likes detail in all area shadows, in all areas of the image, from the highlights down to, sometimes it's just in a part of the face or whatnot. But he doesn't shoot as rock and roll as, say, somebody like I'm also remastering Panic Room right now. And that was shot by mostly by Darius Kanji, I believe, in a style that I don't think he would go for today, because there's much more of a so the blacks are crushed in some of the shots. It's much more rock and roll, and David likes to do that in post now. He likes to keep it all together and really fine tune it, up until the last minute. So all the parts have to be interlocking and adjustable for him. So to answer your question, it's really complex working for David Fincher, because you have to he forces you to look into the details. He really puts your nose in certain things. And at the same time, that you need to have an eye on the bigger picture, and to kind of steer the big ship, at the same time. That's a grand word for what a colorist does. But it's all in there, it's all, everything, all of the above,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that leads me perfectly to like the other side of the coin that I wanted to ask you about. So it's like on one hand, we're starting, I think, to get our more accurate profile. Like, okay, what is it actually like to be Eric doing grades for David Fincher?
Mhm.
So we've talked about like, well, there's a hell of a lot of detail, and that just comes with the territory. But as you just alluded to, there's also that onus to keep an eye on the big picture and steer the ship overall. So that is where my next set of questions comes in of like, you've done, just off the top of my head, a couple of films and shows that are really, they have a really unique thumbprint at kind of like the macro, like global look level. Like Mank is the maybe easiest example there. Like that's an incredibly complex, like modeled system that you've built out that all of those little tiny localized decisions are feeding into. So like now I guess I'm curious to hear about like what role does that portion play, like that macro level, like look design or like modeling play in your process?
Well, I mean, he had some global, some global instructions right from the start. I mean, he shot an 8K monochrome sensor with Leica Simulux lenses, which are some of the sharpest lenses available. And the whole task from that point on was to degrade the image. To degrade this back into 1942 or whatever in it before the making of Citizen Kane. So that all happened in DI, in the grade, with defocusing and adding after they've stabilized the image, adding gate weave and whatnot, and grain, keyframed grains, everything in Mank was such a. I mean, if you look at the mountain range of what the Mank timeline is in Baselight, it's a lot of interlocking parts, and there's a lot of composites with the titles coming in at the same time, the grade fading out or going crazy because it's supposed to be an optical fade, and there's a lot going on there. I'll say that globally on Mank, my approach was Ansel Adams, maybe at the beginning, but David wanted crushed, bloomed blacks, not quite crushed, but bloomed. He wanted this procedural effect that I did with, offsetting, the black, shadows blurred and offset against each other to just get that fine blur area around a contrast zone. But a lot of Mank was dodging and burning, so that those are terms that come from still photography, which is where I came from, which is just darkening and lightening areas of the image, tracking all those areas if they're in movement, and especially in Mank, there was a lot of smoke sort of balancing. They use a lot of smoke machines, and so it's always, trying to make sure that the background is more hazy than the foreground. The foreground should be sharper, and it's just really making sure that the focus. I mean, David has said this himself, that all he's doing in post, and he loves post, by the way, is directing the viewer's eye. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my first pass at Mank was simply dealing with all that smoke and having the right volume, the right depth in the shot, without resorting to rotoscope, and I only asked for roto actually on one, maximum two shots in the whole movie. I did ask for roto, of course, in a lot of these visual effects shots that were part of the day for night scenes. Yeah. I asked for rotoscope, all they could give me in terms of alpha channels.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's so many cool things you just mentioned. I mean, like, just to pick one out of the hat, keyframed grain. I must hear more about this madness.
Well, it was just a necessity. We tried live grain. We were interested in live grain at first because that's, sampled from actual film stocks. I loved live grain personally. I wanted to go for it, but David didn't, because he wanted to be able to change the size of the grain during, the fade outs, what we call optical fades, which were, in the past, it was two pieces of film, being overlaid over each other for the fade to black, or for titles. And during that optical fade, the gamma needs to go sort of wild, crazy. The highlights need to bloom and kind of burst out. and the grain needs to increase dramatically. And so that's why we had to keyframe that. And other than that, we had, certain stock values of grain per, per scene, that we would have less or more grain depending on if it was nighttime. And, in the day for night stuff, we actually added a bunch of grain because it was shot, 2 stops over practically, so that I would then, darken it. And so that was a very clean final result. The day for night looked very clean, which was intentional. That was what Eric Messerschmidt wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that takes me right into that day for night stuff, which we got to talk about. I mean, I have to tell you, when I watched, I like everybody eagerly watched Mank like as soon as it was available. And when that scene came on, that was the first time in a while as a professional, I'm looking at that going like, what the hell are they doing here? Like, I don't know quite, like, I mean, it looks like from a viewer experience, like I loved how it looked, but like in terms of trying to dissect it as a working professional, it was like, I don't know how this look is being achieved, what combination of camera and grading was going on. And you've talked about this a bit before, but I'd love you to take us just through a victory lap of like, how was that day for night look achieved so beautifully for Mank?
Well, Eric and I did, when we did the show Let's, he came by with some red cameras with the monochrome, and we had also tested the Komodo, I think. But we were all really happy to he chose the monochrome. David wanted the monochrome, and that was such a great choice because it really lent an aura of cinematic, purity to what we were about to embark on. So I did a day for night LUT, because this was Eric's idea to shoot day, or Eric and David somehow together, but and to shoot it in a way that they had a lot of bounce, so that there were not a lot of shadows on people's faces and whatnot, and then to shoot it in very bright sunlight. And so that's what it looked like. If you just, toggled on and off all the layers, you get blasted with just pure day, and then so my job was to come up with a curve, which, looked very dark in the beginning and then kind of went up at the end, just bringing, just a weird, looked like a swan, maybe my curve, yeah. Just kind of up, then back down, and then, up at the end. And then some gamma, obviously, you keep all those long walk and talk shots are all keyframes of, dynamic gamma, and everything. There's millions of trackers, and you name it. David, every single, the highlights of the awnings in the background of this, beautiful labyrinth of garden, every single thing needs to be dosed out. He might, if it's really pronounced what he's looking for, he might kick it back to the VFX and have them paint in little things if the tracking is too complex. But I'll tell you, there's multiple trackers all over that stuff. Wow. Looking for, all the right dosage in the penumbra, you need to be, it's, yeah, I get shiver, like, I don't know, was it shivers or, it's hard to watch, because when I watch those, I'm looking for errors, my own errors, yes. And it's quite nerve-wracking, when you get close to, delivery. Yeah. Especially because they stabilize so much, and sometimes they hand me a stab back where everything has changed. So my trackers all need to be updated. It gets pretty down to the wire sometimes. I can imagine that however much time is afforded to you to do your thing, you need every minute and then a few more that you usually don't get. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I'm on the part of the film, part of the crew. I'm hired by the movie. David doesn't pay me directly, so I'm on these things for way longer than any other normal grader would be on a project. And I'm sure there's a few others out there, but this is one way of working, not everybody, it's because David wanted to, he's the kind of guy who just likes to have the ability to change his mind at any point, and to keep adapting, and you have to build it in a certain way that it remains adaptable until the end, Yeah. You obviously have what sounds to me like
like we talked about earlier, maybe not at all the job we might all think that you have, but a very cool job that you're in a great spot to have. But of course, David's lucky to have you as well, and willing to go through all of that, like attention to detail in good spirits and understanding that it's going to make a meaningful material contribution to the end experience of the film. There's a lot of colorists out there that, or even good colorists, who just wouldn't be up to that level of precision, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a certain masochistic, stamina. Everybody here, and in any case, the people that work for David directly are all people that are willing and able to wear multiple hats and to, dig under the hood and, create the tools somehow that we need to satisfy, what's being asked of us.
Yeah, I love it, man. That's a special group of people. I have a random question to ask you about that popped into my head as you were speaking just now. I hear when I've listened to you talk about your work with David in the past, and when I listen to David talk about color as well, there's a word that gets used that has kind of become like a dirty word in color grading circles now: gamma. And I'm just curious, like, what when you tell me you're dropping the gamma, are you literally are you going for like a power function wheel and increasing or lowering it? What does that word mean to you? What role does the tool play in your workflow?
Well, gamma is, it's one of those words like brightness or saturation that it can mean different things to different people. It is a power function, and so it doesn't affect the highlights the same way it affects the midtones. Actually, all I'm saying is really when I say that, I'm literally using the gamma knob in the base grade of base light. I'm just dropping the midtones. I think that's how I refer to it. I mean, Nuke, for example, breaks down the highs, mids, and lows in the shadows, mids, and lows. So you have three. Yeah. It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I personally am not a stickler for. I love standards, obviously, because it enables what we do. I love to be precise about things, but at the end of the day, me personally, David might disagree, but me personally, I think the final result is all that matters, and it doesn't matter how you get there, and the rest is communication, and that's what you should do. You should find out what that director means by gamma. Sometimes you do have to ask the question. What I had a problem at first because David was sometimes saying he in his notes he would just say he would say match to this or match to that, and then sometimes he would just say match, and I was like, but wait, that's the match, or are you saying match that to something you previously, communications, it's really hard. You have to be precise though, so you have to be willing to ask the question. Like you just did.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a funny one, and it's interesting to hear, I guess, those are great insights in general about like the slippery nature of, like I often like to sort of adopt that aphorism that talking about music is like dancing about architecture, like very much the same thing with color. Like talking about this stuff is not easy. But the gamma thing is really interesting to me in particular, just because like, it's so weird, like the vogue and the trend of our craft and the terms that are cool and the tools that are cool and how that changes over time. But I'm interested specifically in the gamma one because it's become it's like, maybe I'm just running in weird circles or something, but it's become almost taboo in the era of like scene referred color managed workflows when everyone's talking about offsets and, like more photometric operations. And yet you're one of many colorists I know who do make great use of a wheel that does something equally as useful as any other wheel might to, as you said, achieve the ends you have in mind. Ultimately, like however you get there is, I would agree with you. Like the results are the only thing anyone's going to see, right?
Absolutely.
Interesting. Well, cool. I mean, so that's so much interesting stuff about, and I guess my other question for you about Mank is on the other long list of like complex, like, behaviors that you implemented with that raw, sharp, camera negative for Mank, like you also you talked about a bunch of stuff like the black blooming and like controlling texture and sharpness and softness. And it sounds to me like that's except in like specific cases, that's all kind of under your DI umbrella, right? That's not that for the most part, that's not being shipped off to VFX, right?
That's all DI. VFX provided the cigarette marks, the old school, real changeover marks.
Yeah.
They provided some dirt, during some of the optical fades, which were, by the way, composited in DI, but they provided those elements. But all the rest, all the defocusing and the bloom, even the blooms sometimes were keyframed. All of that is done in DI. I mean, as far as I can remember, Christopher Dulgaris, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but that Christopher is like a David Starr visual effects artist that also works in-house.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, no, it was all degrading in DI, as far as I remember, yeah.
And is that stuff you were able to achieve within Baselight, or did you have to get fancy with any of those things?
No, it was all done in Baselight. The add grain was the Baselight procedural grain tool, just monochromed out. And the camera shake was what we used for the gate weave. David wanted to add gate weave, which by the way, we removed because to do the film out, because there is a film out version that's on monochrome stock. There's I think 2 copies of it at this point. But there is a monochrome version of the film that's on film, digital film, on actual film. And we removed the faux gate weave, yeah.
I feel like crazy. Every single like mention of every topic brings up 20 more questions I want to ask you. But I have to, for the film out, I have to ask, what was that process? How did you tee up for the printout? What did you, I mean, what were you grading in to begin with? Are you grading in some kind of log scene space for your main grading environment?
Mm-hmm. The main grade was done in red log, R3G10, red, white, gamut. Got it. There is no monochrome, working color space. Otherwise I would have gone for that. Why not? But it's done, with the red RRT version 1.13. And it was graded for an HDR, master, P3, P65. That was the Netflix version. So then I did a theatrical version. I took it to Light Iron because we do have a suite here, a digital Barco sitting behind me back there, but it's not quite, I don't think it quite has the blacks that we were looking for. So then we took it to Light Iron. I did it there, taking basically the log master and then adapting for P3 at Light Iron. That was and that was very difficult after looking at the BVM deep blacks for months and months. Yeah. Adapting, having a week to adapt to, a much different color, sort of contrast levels is very hard, and being unsatisfied and thinking and looking at everybody going, does this feel right to you? Is it okay? Yeah, no, I mean that. Yes, Eric, it's theatrical.
It's 48 nit. It's fine. Those highlights are supposed to get that creamy and low.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
And so to answer your question, I took that version, that final, and then just we just sent that to Photochem and to see what we got back. But we sent a test to Photochem to just check that the general, black and white levels were in the right department. And then I think I did a slight adaptation. I can't remember, actually I need to go back and look. But it was pretty much just taking that and adapting it very quickly for the film out. And then it was just a question of making sure everything was printed properly.
That makes sense.
And that's about it, really.
I think that's fascinating in and of itself. And so you were taking the P3D65 like 1000 nit master and adapting that, or taking the red wide gamut log 3G10 and adapting that?
I took the log 3G10 master. So the master always has the RRT at the end to go to HDR. But I took my final master for Mank for the HDR version. I took that log in log space, took that and then, adapted it for 48 nits for the P3 theatrical. I think I took that same scene file and just, made some TIFFs and sent it to Photochem and see what we would get back. And then I might have made some adjustments from there. But I certainly wouldn't have, what I didn't do was to take just the TIFFs of the P3 and then grade on top of them for the film out. I don't like grading on top of a display space, basically.
Hell yeah. That's for the birds, man. Grade and CNC. That's awesome. I mean, that another just like fun ingredient in the process. You really put the DI back in DI for those prints.
Put the DI back in DI. Great t-shirt. People would just be like, what does that mean? What do you do?
Yeah, that just confuse them further. Oh, cool. Well, I mean, I could ask about Mank all day, but I want to leave time to ask for the modeling that went into another grade for Mindhunter. I'm aware of, and forgive me, I can't remember the effect, but basically the sharpness fall off innate of period lenses that you guys were seeking to model with Mindhunter. And I've seen you talk about that. So there's that piece, and then any other like big pieces that went into like the same kind of like macro level, like model type things that went into Mindhunter.
Well, Mindhunter, David asked for kind of a simulation of widescreen anamorphic lenses, sort of Gordon Willis style, from films like, the Parallax View or Clute, maybe. Those are really amazingly have a distinct widescreen look to them, and so there was the element of having the anamorphic sort of squeezing on the edges, right? And there was the softening, that we also did in Mank. There was softening, defocus as you get closer to the edges. There's a vignette. And there's also what David wanted was chromatic aberration to, simulate, get us in the feel, the look and feel of that era with chromatic aberration. But David being David, he famously doesn't like the color pink, which happens to be the closest to magenta. So the problem I had with chromatic aberration was that, 99, I'm going to say 100% of the filters out there that are readily available, just take the red channel or one of the channels and offset it a little bit. And so you get red on one side and cyan on the other side. So that was all fine and dandy, but David didn't want the red. So I did have to, the first season, basically I had my grade for Mindhunter, all the balancing and whatnot, the colors. And then I would render that and take it into another scene and just I had 25 layers of this lens treatment stuff in base light that was green, the defocus, the chromatic aberration, the gate weave, the vignette, but especially the chromatic aberration took 14 of those layers. So that was all fine and dandy. It was a 2-step rendering process for anything. And HDR having just come out, it was like every night, if I would render and just have, frame ranges to render, but it had to be done on the command line because we had 2 render processes, and it was insane. It was just like text files of render commands that were just like go on forever. But the point about the chromatic aberration was that on season 2, they Baselight added the ability to use GLSL shaders. They call them Matchbox shaders. This was something that was started by Autodesk for flame and luster, and these little shaders are GLSL shaders that are little, they operate on the GPU. And so they're just little bits of code. And me not being a coder, but being a hacker, so just grabbing pieces of code, there's a site called shadertoy.com that's brilliant because people share their pieces of code, and the etiquette is that you simply, credit where you got the piece of code from. But I was able to, I mostly use that for the lens warping. I found the math, the commands for doing the lens warping. But what I had to do in the shader was to subtract basically to the red channel, what was being produced in the red aberration from the cyan red aberration to just get cyan, or to be able to just dose back slightly a bit of pink in there, but not too much so that it would look purple. And yes, I was able to do that with a shader, and it worked. It was much easier. So I had one timeline for, one scene for season 2 as opposed to 2, because it was just more compact. And yeah, it was insane.
I mean, that's so much, and that sounds insane, but that also to me is like the pure essence of what it is to like step in a meaningful way in between an acquired image and a reproduced image. Like, you're talking about really sculpting and authoring like the viewer's experience in a way so far beyond like a typical like spin some knobs and like make it look a little better than it came in. Like, you're fundamentally sculpting that experience with those like all of those textural and spatial considerations. Like, that's such a lot of work, but that's super cool, man.
That's a way that, thank you. That's a way that I think DI has evolved. Visual effects has swung, and DI has swung upstream towards visual effects in ways that people don't realize. People need to learn. Savvy directors and cinematographers are obviously learn. You say that, we can do that. Yes, you can. You have a grid warp right here in DI. Okay, yeah. So I don't like that. That table leg. It's a little bit off. Like, can you straighten that for me? Just there's so much you can do now. So it all kind of adds up sometimes, and you're a little bit like, hey, somebody else do this for me, please. Like,
yeah.
It becomes a lot, but and you have to speak up when people are asking you to do too much or you can't keep up.
Sure. Yeah. There's always that edge where it's like, we can go further, but should we, or should we farm this out to another tool set or practitioner? Man, that is cool. I've another question that kind of relates to what we've talked about with Mank and Mindhunter. And I mean, a lot of the work you've done with David about HDR. Like, you're obviously doing everything in HDR now. Like, how do you and the rest of the team and David think about HDR? What role does it play in in your workflows? Like, aside from the fact that it is a standard and you need to satisfy it, like, what does it mean to you creatively?
To me, it was always super exciting. I mean, the first time I saw HDR, I thought the analogy to me was like, when you looked at a slide on a light box, with a loop, you look down in the slide, and suddenly you would see like light, in a way that you just don't get from a print,
Right.
And it was always like, wow, this is, it always felt like a special thing. Well, now displays are approaching that, there's real, referring much more to the real world, with these dynamic ranges. I was always very excited. But then again, these tools we have, Photoshop for stills, or, Resolve or Baselight for motion or luster or whatnot, they can easily create ugliness as they can create beauty. Yeah. And so these are very powerful tools that you got to be careful not to wield around too much. It depends on your role in the thing, I think I went way too far when I first got HDR, and I was trying to do all this chiaroscuro stuff, and it was just fascinating and fun, to have all 14 stops practically, adjustable on your display. David came out really quickly and said, I don't give a shit about HDR. Not if it's going to change my aesthetic, right. I know, my image is, it needs to come into the service of what we're doing or not at all, and so Mindhunter's HDR levels, so to speak, are quite gingerly, it's like 350 nits or 400, 600 was supposedly our speed limit, or I think.
Yeah.
But he got into it, and mostly his reasoning for that was that he feels like gamma or contrast for colors creates color shifts. You'll have one part of the cheek red and the other part will be, the highlight will be green. The more you sort of stretch things out contrast wise. So he always likes to keep the contrast tight, yes. And so to him, HDR was going to undo that tightness, for Mank, he was much more anything goes in terms of 1,000 nits, no problem. But I don't know if I really answered all of that question.
You answered it and several more, and I think it's interesting to hear you talk about David's relationship with the HDR thing, because it almost sounds to me like, if nothing else, HDR affords you guys to work at whatever, to go as far as David would want. Like when you mentioned earlier in our conversation today, when you're like, David has this, he wants to start by seeing every little gradation and tonal variation, up the whole scale before we start knocking stuff down or crunching things, mm-hmm. or whatever. That the first thing that occurs to me when I'm listening to you say that is that's a tall order with 100 nits, that's really tough to do. So yeah. It seems like at least with HDR, you now have the ability to be like, hey, you want to see every little, idiosyncrasy between every little change in tone up and down the scale. Now you can, and it's just a question of how far you want to go with that versus how much you want to homogenize, like you were saying, and sort of pleasingly blend adjacent tones together. So that seems like it would be, even if it's you're gingerly using it, as you said, that seems like it would be a huge gain for David's aesthetic as well as your excitement over the technology too.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think it's wonderful, the range that you can get. That said, I personally have always been scared of people using HDR in the ways they use sound sometimes, which is way too bombastic and literally trying to jolt people. I haven't really quite seen that though, to be fair. But for me, films are, I'm not a fan of films as video games or roller coaster rides. That's my personal aesthetic. I'm very leery of strobing things, but other than that, I like the fascination of looking at especially as the big screens are going to be HDR. It'll create a new experience. It's fine. It's weird to look at old stuff though. These days, all these masterfully amazing films from the past that just are getting so far, technically from how we're able to do things today. I'm not a perfectionist like some might be in terms of wanting to improve the film along technical lines. That's not me personally. Although it's my job, if asked to do so, I think you can conceivably be asked to do, make an ugly grade, or make a disturbing, grade, something, cut disturbing colors, or things that don't go along the lines of aesthetic beauty. It might not, a show might call for something different, and
hell yeah. Those crayons.
That's the job of the colorist,
those crayons should come out of the box too, right?
Yeah. We haven't used that puke mustard there crayon in a while. I love that.
Dust that one off. Oh man, that's so cool. Last thing on HDR, I have a hunch about your answer, but how do you handle SDR trims? Do you do like a Dolby Vision or an automated thing, or is it do you do like a separate SDR trim pass?
No, I've always done the Dolby Vision trim pass.
Nice.
I'm a believer in, even if you're doing if you have the ability, always do the HDR grade and then make your SDR trim from there. I don't know why, but I just feel like I personally always like to work in the widest gamut possible, even looking at it, and then reduce from there.
Yeah.
It only makes sense. Eric Messerschmidt, by the way, loved HDR from the start, and now they're for the current project, which is called The Killer. They have these Sony the mini BVMs, which are the ones that are about this big, that have the proper deep blacks. I mean, what he sees on set is basically exactly what I see here. As soon as I get the rushes, the R3Ds, and Eric loves that because he says it allows him to shoot a cleaner negative. Because he's not protecting so much for the highlights, he can see pretty much what he has. So intuitively, before when he was monitoring an SDR, even though the histogram might have told him you do have detail in the highlights, like in the window back there or whatnot, he would have intuitively sort of pushed it, then maybe stop down a third or a half a stop just to make sure. But now he knows more. He says, this is all what he says, that he can see more on set, so he's able to leave it a bit more open, knowing what he can do later in post with that.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's so interesting. He's literally seeing more of the image that's being captured when you're monitoring that way. That's
crazy.
Awesome.
Yeah, and yeah, it's amazing how cinematography has changed. I mean, they don't carry cinematographers. I don't think carry light meters anymore.
No,
and not if they're monitoring.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is so awesome about the fact that the way that you are sort of oriented with the rest of the production team, and the fact that, as you said, you're a member of whatever production you guys are working on at the time, means you can have that like meaningful exchange. But I've had so many interesting conversations with cinematographers and colorists and filmmakers about like what you're viewing under changes your decisions. And like the example you just gave about Eric protecting highlights is a great example, but it works on the bottom too. Like how far you fill in your shadows is intimately related to the ratio of the viewing LUT that you're looking through. So when there's when those things aren't in sync the way you guys are in sync, like it obviously fundamentally changes what the perceptions and the decisions that happen on set, which then of course affects what you can do later. That's so cool.
Yeah, well, like me, Eric is lucky. Also, Eric Messerschmidt, he's lucky to be able to test as much as he does for every Fincher shoot, to try out ideas. I don't think he gets that on every movie, but the day for night thing was something that where he did some tests, with how much bounce and fill he wanted to eliminate shadow, so that the day for night itself would you could see the fall off on the side of the face wouldn't go into black. It would you'd still have the differentiation between that and the background.
Yeah. I mean, I'm literally like, I'm just running those images in my head right now. I'm going to go watch that film after we get off. Like that was such a cool achievement for you guys. Oh, and I know the other thing I wanted to ask you, back very quickly to that day for night thing. You mentioned that swan curve that was kind of doing the baseline work for you for printing down. Was there like any kind of like uniform like exposure pull or anything upstream of that, or was the whole thing like your tube stops over day and you're getting down to your base exposure for this look? That was just that curve that you mentioned already.
It was just the curve and the base grade tool. Whatever worked basically.
Yeah.
But no, there was no standard. We're going to shoot this way, and we're gonna you're automatically going to take the R3Ds and render them 2 stops under. No, right. There was not that, because basically with and even if we had, we get EXRs. We make EXRs from the R3Ds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in 99% of the cases, if you take an an R3D, and let's say you're grading an R3D, and you're directly on an R3D, and you take the exposure down 2 stops in the SDK of the R3D, so in the red decode parameters.
Mm-hmm.
If you take it down 2 stops there, so you do that, and then you do the alternative, which is to take the R3D, make a 16-bit EXR from it, which is what we do for everything, and then take it down 2 stops in your DI tool, either Resolve or Baselight. You get exactly the same result. At least in Baselight you do. You can take it down, you take the base grade down -2, and it's exactly -2 stops from the same exact result. So there's no real need. I keep saying there's no real need to rebake these, you guys. But you basically have it all with a linear EXR at your fingertips. You have exactly the same photon count as what's in the R3D.
Dude, we've covered so much in the last couple minutes. Where is this craft of color grading going? Anything that you're like excited about or fearful of in terms of the course that we're on? My humble prediction that I see coming true even right now is that our community is becoming maybe a little less competitive, as you alluded to a moment ago. I think there's historically a bit of kind of like clandestineness and guardedness that is changing. And like, honestly, this conversation to me is a great example. Like, you are at the very top of this field practicing at a very, very high level. And we just talked for an hour, and you were very, very open and generous about the way you do that. So I think that that's a great example of a shift that I do see happening culturally for us right now, that we're becoming more like cinematographers who've been that way forever. They're like, you want to know where I put what light? Go pick up this month's issue of American Cinematographer. It's in there. So I think it's cool to see us moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable. I used to be more protective of how I did what, and at the end of the day, it's also tiresome to do that. There's all kinds of things to benefit from. I share this with you, and you share that with me, and because guess what? I didn't know everything from the start, and I learned from other colorists and master classes and whatnot. But I think there's also a huge dialogue that takes place nowadays just with the cinematographer. The cinematographers need to know a lot of our techniques and want to know, and they have a right to know. And so you just get more used to talking about how the hell you did that, because everybody literally has a computer in their hands, and is able to tweak the image and whatnot as well. I mean, the art of cinematography now is also extremely computer-based as well, in terms of previs, and in terms of finding, the field of view angles and the framings, and they need to know how an image gets stabilized, or it's so much more of we're all kind of overlapping, in a way. Yeah. The visual effects, the DI, the cinematographer, it's blending a bit, the old ways would be that everybody has a distinct role. It's like what the classic analogy is: if you go into a record store and you say, where does country and western stop and folk begin, or R&B or blues begin? Some of these things totally overlap. Yes. So it's hard to create categories.
Yeah. Bring on the blend, man.
Yeah,
I'm into it. Well, man, as I started our conversation with, I feel like we're 1 hour into a dialogue I wish we could have for the next several, but I'm going to give you back your day, and thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and insight. And I'm super excited to get to have heard all of these processes that you are using on these films, and you've got me more excited about making images look interesting. So thanks a bunch, man.
Oh man, it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it was really great talking to you.
Good deal. Well, thanks a bunch, Eric. I'm sure we'll cross paths again very soon.
Likewise.
All right, man. See you.
See you. Thank you.